So, welcome everyone to a wonderful webinar panel on perhaps one of the most crucial topics affecting the Arab world after COVID-19, which is food security. There can be no doubt that food security strategies will have to be amended and adapted over the next few months and years, because most of these economies here are heavily dependent on food trade. We today have an exciting panel which consists of very senior speakers from this region. Our first speaker to introduce is Dr. Mahmoud Solh, who has more than 40 years of contribution to agricultural research and development to enhance food and nutrition security, as well as enhancing human and institutional development in the Middle East, North and Eastern Africa, Central and South Asia. He got his PhD in genetics from the University of California, in the United States. He had served as ICARDA's general director from 2006 until 2016, during the most critical period of ICARDA's 40 years history due to the challenges in Aleppo. More recently, Dr. Solh has been the vice chair of the high-level panel of experts for food security and nutrition of the Committee for World Food Security. And he's currently a member until the year 2021. Moreover, he has authored more than 120 publications and papers and articles, including books and book chapters. His contribution to agricultural research and development has been recognized through several prestigious awards and honors, including lifetime achievements from the FAO, the University of California at Davis in the United States, the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in Uppsala, and the Gregor Mendel Award of Germany, and also the Norman Borlaug Award. Our second speaker today will be Dr. Rasheed. Dr. Turki Rashid is the founder and CEO of Golden Grass Incorporated, which is an agriculture and contracting company based in Saudi Arabia. He's an adjunct professor at the College of Agriculture and Life Science at the Department of Agricultural and Biosystems Engineering at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Moreover, he's also an advisor to the Environment and Sustainable Development Unit here at the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences at the American University of Beirut. Dr. Rasheed has authored more than half a dozen books, and his most recent publication is on public governance and strategic management capabilities, public governance in the Gulf states. Then we have Dr. Ghada Ahmed, who joins us from the United States. In fact, I believe from San Francisco, as we can tell from a background picture. Dr. Ahmed is at Duke University, and she's also working as a senior advisor and consultant to the World Bank, to the US Agency for International Development, the FAO, and other international organizations and businesses. Her work is very much impact-oriented and targeted towards partnerships across the public, private, and social sectors in many projects such as food security, agribusiness, technology, and workforce development. Then we have our next speaker, who I hope will be with us soon. It's Mr. Charles Kleinerman, who's the head of ICARDA's Capacity Development Unit since October 2014, based in Cairo. Also, he is the ICARDA focal point to the European Union and as such in charge of the development of ICARDA Public-Private Partnership Initiative. Before that, he served as the technical training officer at ICARDA Capacity Development Unit until from April 2012 until September 2014, back then based in Amman. Prior to joining ICARDA, Mr. Kleinerman has been the Deputy Secretary General of the European Movement International, an international NGO financed by the European Union based in Brussels, Belgium, and he was in charge of coordinating the different capacity development activities organized out of the 42 national councils of the European movement. Rachel Bahn is the coordinator of the food security program here at AUB, and she's also an instructor of agribusiness at the American University of Beirut. Her research interests include food security, food systems, and food retail, and economic policies and programming in developing country contexts. Rachel was previously based in Washington, D.C., where she served as an economist with the United States Department of Treasury and the United States Agency for International Development. She holds degrees from Johns Hopkins University of Advanced International Studies and from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, our other speaker, Dr. Musa Meki, had to withdraw because he fell sick, so we wish him all the best that he's quickly on the mend again. Great shame that he can't join us. We begin with our introductory statements of approximately 4 to 5 minutes. And the topic is, what has been the impact of COVID-19 on food security and food systems in the MENA region, and what are the strategic responses needed? Dr. Mahmoud Solh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. Certainly, the MENA region has been facing very serious challenges with respect to food security way before the COVID-19. I'm not going to go through these because this takes time, but what I wanted to mention that the COVID-19 is complicating further the economic, social, and food security situation in the MENA region. It is already affecting the food system directly through the impact on food supply as well as on food demand. The other impact, which is indirect, is through the decrease in the purchasing power of the people. When we look at the lay down that we have in the Middle East and North, actually globally, but in the Middle East and North Africa, already unemployment is very high. And with COVID-19, this is really increasing drastically. It is shocking. You know, I have seen figures as much as 50% unemployed, 60% unemployed. So this is, to me, is a very serious impact on the purchasing power and accessibility. So I would say the most affected will be the poor for sure, and the low income people. And this is where I think it is very important for governments that certainly with economic capability to try to help these people one way or another in order to pass through this difficult time. When we come to the food security and the nutrition, COVID-19 is affecting all the 4 pillars, and now became 5 pillars or 6 pillars now, of food security. The food availability, as we know, lots of people involved in food production are locked down, and people are very concerned about interaction with others, and therefore the whole aspects in the food chain with respect to production will be affected. As I mentioned, access to food will be affected because of the low purchasing power of the people in general, particularly low-income people, and the stability of production is compromised since agriculture inputs may not be available on time for the farmers, as well as the fact the ability to be able to control diseases and insect pests may not be really possible. With respect to food utilization, the problem that we have, I think, unless we really have good nutritional food, the immunity of the individual will be affected, which means that he will be more vulnerable to COVID-19. I'm not going to go in detail. There are many, many other areas, but I leave the other colleagues to comment, and then when the questions are raised, we can respond accordingly. I'm not talking about what measures to be taken unless you want me to do that. I can talk about it, or we can do it at a later stage, Martin.
We're going to do this at a later stage. So thank you
Okay.
very much, Dr. Solh. Dr. Turki Rashid, please help us with your perspective.
Good morning, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Eid Mubarak. Thank you, Martin, for arranging such a very vital, important topic. My topic is food security, Saudi Arabia, COVID-19 challenges. Well, first of all, food security is not only about food. It is all about national security, chronic hunger, threaten individual, threaten government, societies, and border. Food security strategy locally in Saudi Arabia is a priority now. The local agriculture provides 30% of the food consumption. Saudi Arabia currently depends 85% of their food import. 4/5 of the planet, 7.8 billion mouths, depend on food import in 2020. Let's just look at it in 20 years. Food trade went from $500 million to $1.5 trillion. That is 3 times higher. What is the pandemic impact? The vulnerability of Saudi food supply chain distributions and network. We need to support local farmer and local food production. Panic buying of food supply has caused shortage in the food in many countries. Luckily, Saudi Arabia was an exemption because it happened before the month of Ramadan and Hajj. Food supply, usually it's abundant at that time. Romania, Russia, Kazakhstan, Vietnam have restricted export of food. What are the pandemic challenges? The globalization and the liberalization of the economy work very well, but in normal condition. In time of crisis, swift changes, demand for safety and the well-being of the citizen. We need to decentralize the manufacturing to move away from a rigid centralized supply system. Big supermarkets currently control the bulk of food supply and market. We need to support small-scale food production and retail system that can supply the local community. Let's look at Saudi agriculture business. It contributed $14 billion annually. That's about 3.4% of the non-oil GDP, 900,000 workers in that sector. The total agriculture holding is about 346,000. The number of farms is about 262,000. Animal herd, fish farm, it's about 85,000. Let me summarize what I want to say. Permission to Saudi national to deliver food supply have made it easier for a lot of people. Example, my house was done through Jahiz. Local farmers have been hard hit on the coronavirus pandemic, despite the government assistance. The Saudi supply chain need to adapt to the new system of diversification and simplicities to the new reality. We need to increase our food production in a sustainable way. Saudi Arabia will depend on innovation, technology, for example, urban farming. Let me conclude my talk. The implication of food supply chain, many people were unable to secure affordable food. Panic buying has caused food supply in the supermarket to a minimum. Urban farming, such as vertical farming, can address some of those issues. I will close my talk. Sustainable agriculture development is one of the best tools to enhance food security, alleviate poverty, and promote economic growth. I'm happy to take your questions and your comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turki. And now we hand over to Ghada Ahmed. Ghada, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin, and thank you, everyone, and Eid Mubarak to everybody. I'm really excited about this because this is such an important topic and something that we've been discussing with including in the current project with the FAO on fisheries, as a matter of fact. So I want to say that with regards to the COVID-19 and food security dynamics, we need to be thinking about a new normal that we are going to be diving in. And sort of that new normal is looking at the existing food systems or global food value chains that have been in the process of formalizing and expansion over the last 20 some years. And now the system is suddenly collapsing. And just to kind of give an idea, the COVID-19 outbreak is actually costing GVCs about $50 billion in exports, mostly because of China. And these losses sort of, with time, had a ripple effect on the entire global food systems. Now, why is that important in terms of food for MENA is because MENA is highly dependent on imports. With the over specialization and concentration of agriculture systems in certain locations that depend on distributing or exporting these foods to MENA countries, with the breakdown due to the COVID-19 that sort of impacted MENA in more than one way. So when we talk about GVCs, we're thinking about how global value, how each country or how trade is intertwined and linked, not just from one country in terms of exports, but how the internal dynamics of a value chain. So anywhere we're importing inputs, we're importing labor, we're exporting processed foods. To give you an example, in the United States, even with the fish sector, it's highly dependent on imports, but it's also highly dependent on processing in other countries. So fish that's being fished in the United States is exported to Asia for processing and then being re-imported to the United States. Now, what happened with the COVID-19, an entire breakdown that has this ripple effect on MENA, and my colleagues here had referred to some. And just to summarize some of these impacts, once the breakdown in the supply chains, anywhere from, we saw a slowdown in trucking activity due to workers being sick, anywhere from stricter border crossing to anywhere to a stop altogether, a halt of border crossing in Europe and US, North America, and also parts of Asia. And we started seeing all of a sudden, as a result of this breakdown in that particular portion of the supply chain, then we started seeing all of a sudden a resurgence, or what we called a resurgence of protectionist sort of trading activity or trading policies that are impacting MENA. To give you an example, for example, that all of us have felt at one point here in the U.S. and that effect is definitely felt in the Middle East, is the lack of rice. And all of a sudden, Vietnam halted rice exports. That was expected to be sometime until March or April for it to last, but so far this particular ban has not been lifted. Indian traders are not renewing their export contracts. And also Russia is limiting the grain exports. Now, these are specific dynamics that are specifically going to impact the MENA region, because again, it's highly dependent on these countries for importing grains, importing rice, importing wheat and that kind of stuff. So what does that really mean? At the beginning of the COVID-19, we saw, we started seeing this export bans and things like that. In my opinion, it's the COVID-19 has just highlighted a couple of the policy failures and the market failures that we're seeing on a global trend, and then we're seeing the impact of it on the localized level. And at the same time, we have seen an acceleration in the protectionist aspects that have actually started prior to the COVID-19. So the COVID-19, in a way, from a certain market perspectives, have accelerated that sort of decoupling, what we are calling decoupling of trade, that started before the COVID activity. And you could see from that, like, for example, President Trump's statements in relation to, trade restrictions and so forth. Recently, the most recent thing is putting additional trade restrictions or other sort of aspects that are impacting the food sector, like again, fish is one of them, where their environmental regulations are being put out in order to encourage increased local production of the United States in the aquaculture sector, which again has implications on the MENA region. So to kind of sum this up, as we're thinking of food and trade and what does that mean for MENA, if we think about it from a global value chain perspective, that we've all been connected, we've all been dependent on imports at one level or another in one segment of the value chain or another. Because of that dependency also came with an over-specialization. That over-specialization means that Russia, for example, has specialized in grain production, in wheat, for example. It is also hosting the international firms that are highly specialized in the processing of these grains and the movement of these grains, that you know them as the ABCDs of trade, Cargill, ADM, Glencore, and so forth. These guys control about 70 to 90% of global trading in the grain sector. That over-specialization with a major event like COVID-19, it impacted trading. It caused a breakdown in multiple systems due to that essential part in the chain, which is the central part, which is the processing and the logistics. Now that part broke down. We were unable to move goods, which then rippled on the supermarket level and on the consumer level, because that's where we're unable to move to find the goods. In terms of MENA and other countries as well, that are other regions that are experiencing the same thing, challenges in relation to the devaluation of the local currencies, because we have to trade. We are buying things in US dollars. The high unemployment rate means lower incomes, and the other things that my colleagues here have mentioned. But the solution to this, if we rethink this over-specialization, the problem here is how do we rethink the over-specialization and the over-concentration of power in value chains? And if we are dependent on only 5 firms for about 70 to 90% of our global trading in the grain sector, and it's not just grain, they're in grains, they are in animal production, and then they're also in, and now they're entering the aquaculture sector. Where are we with that? I do think that in the MENA region, we really need to be a bit more focused on how do we reactivate, re-energize our agriculture sector a bit more sustainably, as Dr. Turki mentioned. And I think we should definitely be having more private sector friendly in terms of the localized private sector institutions. We need to rethink our logistics, and definitely we have to be considering the automation of our ports and the automation of our agriculture system, which is something that's definitely, again, has been, it's been fast-tracked since the COVID-19. Thank you.
Thanks, Ahmed. Normally we would now have Charles Kleinerman, but he just got back that he has a power cut in Cairo. And we've been lucky so far over the past few weeks that technology didn't cause any trouble. However, this time it seems to be different. So let me hand over to Rachel for her introductory statement. Rachel Bahn, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for letting me be part of today's panel. To provide an introductory statement on the impact of COVID-19 on food security and food systems in MENA and the strategic responses needed, I want to raise 5 points. And some of this will pick up on the overall themes that were mentioned by Dr. Solh, but I think it's important that we actually get a good grounding of where things stand in the MENA region specifically. My first point is that MENA was already reporting varied but overall limited progress with regards to food and nutrition security in recent years on different metrics linked to SDG 2, including undernourishment and malnutrition. The FAO North Africa Regional Overview of Food Security and Nutrition just this week published that report was published. Nearly 55 million people in the Arab states, or 13.2% of the population, are hungry. So that goes to undernourishment. We also have serious problems with malnutrition in the region. Many countries carry a double burden of malnutrition, including overweight and obesity and undernutrition. A high or very high prevalence of stunting in children, under the age of 5 persists in nearly half of the Arab states. Anemia is another severe public health health issue in certain countries. And the trends in overweight and obesity are worsening for both children and adults. So the baseline was not great. My second point, a confluence of factors has already worsened food insecurity in the MENA region in recent years, and or the ability of governments to respond to that challenge. And that's even before we get to COVID-19. The 2020 Global Report on Food Crises estimated that 135 million people were acutely food insecure or worse in 2019. Of these, 43 million live in MENA, and the 10 worst affected countries include Yemen, Syria, and Sudan. We see that there are different drivers that are pushing those numbers higher, and those include conflict and insecurity, extreme weather, and economic shocks. The economic shocks that we've seen have affected the region, including reduction in oil revenues, this limited scope for public expenditure in countries including Algeria, Iraq, and Libya. That has in certain cases contributed to a significant reduction in remittances in countries that highly depend on those, including Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. So those were falling as a result of declining oil revenues, as well as overall economic contraction, and that will be exacerbated by COVID-19. That means those households that depend on remittances have less ability to undertake productive investment, for example, in agriculture, or to supplement their consumption, including for food. We also see issues of currency depreciation that are affecting countries, including Lebanon, Syria, making imported food that much more expensive and limiting access to agricultural inputs. We have a pretty dire situation economically. We see from the latest IMF projections that we should have widespread economic contraction across the MENA region in 2020. Only Djibouti and Egypt are expected to avoid GDP contraction in 2020. And that ranges from a couple points contraction, which is not great, to 12% contraction in Lebanon, to 58% contraction in Libya. So this is going to have negative impacts on food and nutrition security even before we add on COVID-19. And the 2020 Global Report on Food Crises, in fact, predicted that acute food insecurity would worsen in the MENA region in 2020, with a particularly worse impact in places like Yemen and in other conflict-affected areas and economically hit areas. My third point, COVID-19 has obviously exacerbated all of this. And as we heard from Lauren Landis in this seminar several weeks ago, WFP estimates that another 130 million individuals will fall into acute hunger by the end of the year. So that's nearly a doubling from the pre-COVID projections. And while we don't have country-by-country estimates, that's going to be concentrated in Africa and the Middle East. So the situation will get worse. In terms of responses, my fourth point, strategic responses need to address our longer-term underlying challenges and not overlook those, as well as address the stress that's being imposed by COVID-19. So these longer-term issues that are linked to poverty, income inequality, vulnerability, gender disparities, and problems within the food system, we can't forget about those as we're designing short-term critical responses. My fifth and final point, strategic responses need to consider food and nutrition security from a broad perspective and not solely focused on agricultural production. It seems that the agricultural production, those impacts are perhaps clearer or more easy to anticipate or more obvious, but the longer term impacts, including on nutrition, must not be overlooked, as has tended to be the case in food security strategies and policies in the MENA region in the past. I'll close my intro there and look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for your important introductory statements. We're open now for the moderated questions. My first question is to Dr. Mahmoud Solh. You sit on the high-level panel of experts on food security, which published recently the impact of COVID-19 on food security and nutrition. From your perspective, which message in this publication is the most relevant to the MENA region?
Thank you very much, Abed. First of all, again, it's a good opportunity to discuss this subject among experts that we know. My point is that the high-level panel realized that there is lots of efforts that need to focus on the most vulnerable people that are affected by COVID-19. Now, governments, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, should put agriculture and food production high in their priority list. If you remember what happened in the crisis of 2008, many countries moved in the Arab world from self-reliance to self-sufficiency. And after that, many countries, including the Gulf states, not only invested locally, but also invested overseas to ensure food security. So the report emphasized the fact that governments should certainly put agriculture and food production on top of their strategies for sustainable agricultural development. This is one point. The other that the report emphasized, governments should prioritize the most vulnerable and affected by COVID-19 and its impact, because I think these are the people that we need to help. In the MENA region, what's relevant is that 80% of the food is produced by small farmers. Therefore, the focus should be how best can we provide incentives for the small farmers in order to continue producing. Not only that, I think we should also see how best we can protect them from being affected by health-wise by the virus itself. So I think this is another dimension that we need to do. Now, considering the fact that in the Middle East and North Africa, I would say, depending where you are, between 40 to 85% of the food is imported, depending what countries you're talking about. I think what we really need to do, how best can we really facilitate the imports and reduce the procedure required for food imports. The problem, as has been mentioned by other colleagues, fortunately so far we did not see a spike in food prices as we did in 2008. And the reason for that is that the demand went down, not only that, and at the same time, all prices went down. So I think this is part of the reason why we did not see the spike in prices. But this does not mean things will continue that way. I think Ghada did mention that we will, certainly some countries already started sort of reducing their exports or even banning the exports of food like rice and major food commodities. So we do expect prices to go up, but not in probably in the medium to long term. And therefore, this is where the local production should be very much improved. Now, with the lockdown, one area that the report emphasized is the importance of urban and peri-urban agriculture. Urban and peri-urban agriculture, this means you produce your own food in your garden or at the rooftop. You know, we had a good project in Egypt, green food from green roofs, where women associations managed to produce their own vegetables on the rooftop through simple hydroponics. So I think urban and peri-urban agriculture should be increased. Then again, you need, the government should support the whole supply chain and avoid disruption in the food trade, because this is very, very important, and they should really see how best they allow the workers in agriculture to move around. You know, as you know, when we talk about a lockdown, we certainly put exemption on pharmacies, on not restaurants, I would say supermarkets and so forth. But I think the agriculture workers should be considered as important people to protect, to put an exemption on so that they can move around and do their job. Then the other aspects is how best we enhance the resilience in the food system to these shocks. And this is something where you have to provide some incentives. You have to make sure that the inputs for agriculture are still available timely. And this is where governments should really give attention to that. Otherwise, the whole supply chain will be affected. And then again, some extension, I would say, programs should be developed to reduce food waste. I mean, yes, food waste, it was a problem before, but with COVID-19 now, the food waste is becoming more of a serious problem because 35% of the food is wasted throughout the food system, from production to post-harvest handling to marketing and distribution and consumption. And therefore, it is so important for governments to make sure that the food losses are reduced to the minimum. I think the other point that I wanted to mention, the private sector, which plays a very important role in food security and nutrition. And this is where, again, one has to look at the problems facing the private sector with the COVID-19 measures and see how best we can help them to continue their role in food security and nutrition. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Solh, for this very important point. And you mentioned the importance of the private sector. So let's ask the next question to our representative from the private sector in Saudi Arabia, Dr. Turki Rashid. Dr. Turki, Saudi Arabia has become quite infamous for pursuing a strategy of importing food by investing in overseas agricultural production. Could this strategy be under threat now as food supply chains face pressure to localize as a result of COVID-19?
Thank you for the question. As a moderator, what is the time allocate for me to answer the question?
Well, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, if we look at the Saudi strategy, first of all, I talk in my own capacity. I don't talk on behalf of any other organization that I'm working with or I am associated with. When Saudi Arabia decided to go for the food securities, the decision was a political decision, as when we were facing threat in the 80s. So the main drive then, it was a political move. Then it became the 2000s when we discover the cost of food production is very high in terms of water. So we could not sustain that system. Then we decided to go into other venue, which is the total productions from different places. I would appreciate if you could share with us the graph that I have sent you, Martin. So the Saudi decision decided to go with food security that is the broad term of definition for it, which is it will be using the other stakeholders, like buy stakeholders in other companies, go with the local market, go with the market derivative, and use a very good facility of storage facilities. Those 5-6 pillars will give the Saudi the ability to have a free hand in some way. But as we always know, when crisis happened, liberalization, open market, it's a good system only in time of a good time. But when crisis happened, we need to have a certain production of our food locally. Currently, Saudi Arabia, as I said, 85% depend on import. Even though agriculture provides about 30% of our local consumption, but we should always go with at least 30% of our need. It should be grown locally until the crisis disappear or it was easy. As we said in 2007, 2008, when the financial crisis, it hit at a very bad time. Production was very bad and the storage was very low. At least in this time, we were in a much better position because production was high and the storage facilities everywhere was quite good. So we were not affected as much as we did in the 2007. But to answer your question, we should concentrate at least 30% on our food production. It should be locally. And I think almost like the 30% level, it's quite good for everybody. Even I think there is a strategies from Singapore that in 2030, they should have their own production for 30%. And they will use all the technology to achieve that. I hope I answered your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Turki Rashid, for your insightful comments on the Saudi Arabia private sector work. And my question now is to Dr. Ghada Ahmed. I want to take you back to the governments. In your perspective, what are the steps that the governments can do in the MENA region to minimize the disruption of value chains, for example, like wheat, which they rely on heavily in light of COVID-19?
Okay, well, that's a big and a loaded question, because the problem with wheat and grains, and now also we can add to that meat as well, these are highly political food items in the MENA region. So it's not just about the wheat, it's about what the wheat represents in terms of the government. Sort of stability, or sort of how the government is perceived by its people. And the same thing with meat as well. I'm just going to take you a step back. And as I mentioned, the MENA region, yes, it is highly dependent on imports. And it's highly dependent on imports on many things. So wheat, maize, or corn, soybeans, all sorts of stuff, meats that come from Brazil. And when I mentioned the breakdown in the COVID-19 situation, so anywhere from, for example, the meat or slaughterhouses and the processing facilities in Brazil, for example, that export meat to Egypt or to anywhere in the region, there's a breakdown in that system. And so that would limit how much will come to the MENA, or it will increase in prices. We're already seeing, I think USDA was estimating that there's some breakdown that's a decrease in exports that could be, that's in some cases as high as 40% in some of these items. So these are really high numbers that we're looking at. In terms of MENA, as Dr. Turki and others, as we're thinking about moving towards more localized production, that's easier said than done. Like it was mentioned earlier, there are limitations on land. We've already exhausted a lot of water resources. And in some countries where we're trying to go and move towards a more aggressive localized production, in addition to that, we also have a labor challenge. And the labor challenge, for example, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, other countries are highly dependent on imported labor. I'm originally from Egypt, and most Egyptian fallahin, the Egyptian farmers, are all over the region. Unfortunately, from the interventions by the government starting the 50s onwards have led to sort of a semi-collapse, so that I'm not too overly dramatic, of the agriculture systems, meaning that we have never sufficiently invested in the agriculture system since the 50s onwards in trying to develop and innovate and making sure that our agriculture systems are evolving with everything else. We have not invested in the farmer and its education. We talk about subsidies, but we talk about subsidies in terms of subsidizing inputs, for example, or there's a limit as to how much we can subsidize, right? There's always going to be a level of imports, as we know in the value chain. We're importing fertilizers and pesticides to begin with. If we're talking about livestock production, we are going to be also importing different items that will be part of the veterinary sort of services that are provided to the animal health. There are all these things. So we have not looked at the food system as a system in of itself and how it functions. Not only this, we're talking about an acceleration or a shift that happened today that that some are referring to. It has accelerated the technology adoption in the agriculture sector by several years. So where is MENA in terms of that? And when we're talking about MENA in terms of that, we're talking about anywhere from automated supply chains to how are we providing access to the farmer to markets? How are we automating that process? Blockchain in terms of traceability and so forth in terms of the health of the agriculture system. So as the MENA governments look into what can be done to address the situation, we need to go back to the basics of how do we rethink agriculture to begin with, agriculture systems, because what we think of as agriculture now is very different from what we thought about as agriculture 20 or 30 or even 10 years ago. So we need to think about how are we educating our farmers, and invest in farmer education, invest in farmer literacy, invest in nutrition and understanding nutrition and health, because these are intertwined with how people eat and how the farmers also produce. We need to be investing in opening up markets for the agriculture sector so that the landowners and the farmers are able to produce things a bit more in a bit more connected way to the market systems. And we definitely need to invest in allowing private sector and innovation to emerge. And I mean by this something very specific. We have already learned a lesson with the COVID-19 in terms of the over-specialization and the large business, the large agribusiness, and the risks associated with that. If I have a system breakdown in a company like Cargill or Glencore, it's not only impacting my access to wheat, it's also impacting my access to meat. It's impacting several things. That over-specialization is really the opposite of the diversification that we keep talking about. So we need to be diversifying sources of how we're accessing this by investing in the startups. There's a lot of agribusiness startups that have a lot of potential in the Middle East. Why not invest in the young people and what they're thinking about? They're the future generation, and we need to be including them more in the thinking about agriculture. I've met some of the most talented people in Egypt, in Morocco, in Jordan, working in agribusiness startup. Why not facilitate and provide them with financing, private sector financing, and help them address this issue instead of putting the onus, all of the effort and trying to put it on the government. What the government really needs to do at this point is open up the space in MENA. Open up the space for these different actors to be involved in the agriculture sector, to be involved in thinking and providing more of a co-designing of the agriculture sector, what needs to happen in order not just to address COVID and post-COVID-19 sort of situation, but also in the next 20 to 50 years as the agriculture sector is reframing itself into a world that's full of automation. What does that look like? That's over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ghada. Next question is to Rachel. How's the financial and economic crisis in Lebanon compounding the food security challenge that Lebanon's government faces as a result of COVID-19? What policy responses can it take to these overlapping challenges?
Thank you, Martin. We've in some ways positively seen that the government has acknowledged the risks posed by COVID, and in combination with the underlying economic, fiscal, banking crises, to food and nutrition security. So we saw that in the recent communication from the Prime Minister. So at least acknowledging those challenges, that's a first step. What have the impacts of these combined crises been so far that we've seen? Unfortunately, they've been quite drastic, as those of us living here can attest. We've seen a reduction in wages or lost employment that's expected to have widespread and negative effects on rising poverty levels. We've seen the lost value of or access to savings, which has reduced the availability of those resources, and people are less able to use those to cushion the shock or reduce their, therefore it's reducing household resilience. In terms of inflation and particularly food prices, the WFP has tracked the price of the basic consumer basket in Lebanon. It's gone up by 40% between September and March of this year alone, and we certainly expect that those will continue to rise. In terms of what we've seen more on the agricultural side, the inability to access finance for the import of agricultural inputs has challenged planting and harvesting for the crop side, and also, as Ghada just mentioned, it will probably have adverse effects on livestock production as well. And the impacts have also been a bit more subtle than that. So inputs have typically been paid for by farmers with an informal credit arrangement where they're getting credit from their input suppliers. But that was expected to be tightened up in the short term as they shifted to cash-based arrangements, meaning farmers would be less able to access inputs, and therefore we should see an adverse effect on production in the current, in future seasons. The CREAL estimates for agricultural production and GDP in Lebanon that were taken on before the worst of COVID was that there would be a decrease by 38%. So plant production would decrease more so than animal production. And that would be a combined effect of the lack of credit facilities, the already ongoing currency depreciation, and the reliance on imported inputs. We also expect that there will probably be, in terms of more food and nutrition security at the household level, shifts in household food production. So as households that are adversely affected by whether it be income channel, employment, and also facing food price increases, they're probably going to have to cope by either shifting their food consumption to reduce consumption or shift to less nutritious foods. I don't think we've seen great evidence yet on what that will be, but I think it's quite widely expected that those will probably have negative effects on individual and household nutrition metrics. We've also seen some policy actions that might end up having unintended consequences, and so it's a bit unclear what those will do to possibly exacerbate the situation. One example has been the policy that was sort of announced, and it's actually unclear where it stands, by the central bank to push small lenders from the banking system. So it might have adverse effects on their access to finance. And while this effort to push them out of the system may mean that they face fewer risks come any financial restructuring that will go on as part of a longer term effort to tackle the financial sector, it also means that their access to finance is reduced. And that could have a particularly challenging, that could be a problem for small account holders who want to use access to finance to invest in agricultural production, especially when we've just seen that, these access to inputs, for example, are shifting to, cash only operations. Or when we've seen that, the possibility to get a bank loan is, if it was there before, it's probably much, much more difficult now. We have a context where wholesaling of a lot of horticultural products is done on consignment. So there's less margin, there's less cushion, and this effort to push those folks out of the system may have unintended consequences that it's unclear of what action could or should be taken, if any, is being planned. What are some of the responses the government could take? Well, as has been noted, the economic crisis has at least had the effect of renewing interest in Lebanon's real economy and its productive sectors, especially agriculture, and the opportunity for import replacement. Import substitution has been the real focus thus far of the conversation. Efforts that need to be done to pursue that or support that would include prioritizing foreign currency for inputs of agricultural inputs, specifically those that can't alternatively be supplied by domestic suppliers, and focusing on products that are critical to food consumption basket in the short term. Lebanon could take a look at its food subsidy system over the longer term to see if alternatives can be supported that are more reinforcing of food and nutrition security. So not only at the level of the agricultural producer, but also for the consumer. It might be, it might be time to rethink the tobacco subsidy. Is there something else that could be produced that may have a longer, better impact on food and nutrition security in this country, while also compensating farmers for local production? Lebanon has pursued an agriculture export strategy that tends to be more regionally oriented, so focusing on Gulf and parts of Europe. Can it be further localized to capitalize on what might end up looking like shorter supply chains? It's unclear if that longer term thinking is starting. Where we've also seen projects in the past couple of years to improve value added from agricultural production, so low-level processing. Can that be expanded to capture more of the value for the sector? Can that be reoriented towards more import substitution at a reasonable cost? Those are, I think, valuable questions to ask. On more of the social side, there have been promises to expand the social safety net, but that obviously needs to be pursued, particularly as we will see poverty increase. And even the IMF realizes the importance of social safety nets these days. So that shouldn't be given as an excuse to not provide support to particularly vulnerable households. That needs to happen. Underpinning all of that is the fact that the government needs to continue to collect and monitor key outcomes around the agricultural availability side of food security, as well as access and kind of household level, individual level outcomes. For example, 2020 would have been the year when Lebanon would conduct its agricultural census. That's a once every 10-year exercise. And that data is really important to inform policies and strategies. Is that going to happen this year? Will it need to be redone next year, as this year is going to be such an atypical year with so many shocks? So I think that the government should not overlook those perhaps mundane things around data collection and statistics that really are important for evidence-based policy.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's go back to Saudi Arabia. In the recent decades, Saudi Arabia has shifted its policies promoting domestic agricultural production due to environmental pressures, specifically the over-extraction of water resources. Dr. Rasheed, do you expect that the COVID-19 will provoke any similar shifts in the Saudi Arabia agricultural policies? And how do you think?
Well, we realize what's our limitation, what are the strategies. When you do a strategies, you have to look at all your SWOT analysis, what your strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat. Our major threat is water scarcities. So we have to work with that, and we have to use technology to overcome that. And we need to balance out all our resources. We have to take the full benefits of the market derivative. We have to take the full benefits of partnership. As you could see, we just obtained 29% of one of the largest companies who produce rice in India. And Saudi import rice in two kinds of rice. We import the white rice, we could import it from anywhere, but mainly Saudi don't eat white rice. They eat only yellow rice, which is the yellow rice is only produced in the Punjab, which is basically India and Pakistan. So we went and we bought that 30% or 29%. And then we go to other countries and we buy shareholders with the food production company. Then at the same time, we go direct investment. And again, we go with Saudi investor and we finance them. Now we know all these things are very good, but it works in a normal condition. But when a crisis hit, you have to be prepared for emergency. And that emergency, we need to depend on our local consumption. I'm very happy with the move now of Saudi Arabia. They have made based on the on the area, like they made an agreement with the IFAD, and they go to Jizan, and they go to area of Saudi Arabia, which is they have a good qualities of water and quite a good water. But the water should be, irrigation should go by crops per drops. And we need to do as much as we can to reach the 30% on our strategic crops. Saying all that, not to neglect the abilities to storage facility. We must have a good storage facilities to hold us through the crisis. We're lucky that when the COVID come or hit Saudi Arabia, we were very lucky because it came just before Ramadan and Hajj. And through Ramadan and Hajj, we really, all our supply is abundant. I mean, people are in Saudi Arabia, they could go to the supermarket is full of everything you could think of it. And we should give a credit to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia have managed the crisis. One of the fewest countries in the world have achieved a good success on managing the crisis. Why? Because leaders were ready for it. Every year in Mecca, we have Ramadan and we have Hajj. So every year, leaders, the public are prepared mentally. There is a crisis could come. So it's not like we go through the denial and then we go said, no, we don't have it. Such like happened, like sometimes superpower, their ego cover their weakness, like what happened in the US, like what happened in the UK and other countries. So we took a really good measure, and the only good people could compare Saudi Arabia, could compare it to South Korea, you could compare it to Singapore, Taiwan. Those are the country which is they take the early measure, and we were ready, we took the early measure. Could you imagine, I mean, not even in the wildest dream, the king of Saudi Arabia will close Mecca and Medina, will close all the mosques. Those things, they were a very hard decision to make, but we need to make it. And we did make it. So to answer your question, there is no one simple answer. As I said on my graph, we have to look at all the other aspects. We have to buy, we have to grow, we have to use the market derivative, we have to finance Saudis for investment, we have to go and partner with food production. So all this will create a sustainable agriculture, food security strategies, in my own opinion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turki, for your very important input. The next question goes to Ghada Ahmed. Also in light of what Dr. Turki just said, how can global value chains be adjusted to improve food security outcomes in MENA post-COVID-19? And also, in connection to improved nutrition, what do you think? What needs to be done? Perhaps should the MENA region purchase a trader such as Bunge or Cargill? What do you think?
It's sort of going back to the food security research and that focus specifically on MENA, oil producing versus non-oil producing. I just want to mention a couple of things. First is the fact that we're thinking crisis thinking right now. And now there's a crisis thinking and there's long-term thinking. So yes, we need to be responding to the current crisis, but at the same time, it's an opportunity. And the opportunity here is to be thinking more in the long term and addressing systematic weaknesses that have been in the MENA food systems over the last 50 or so years that have sort of exacerbated as we start experiencing population growth and over specialization, over dependency on imports, lack of attention to nutrition and natural resources, a lack of investment in young people and in the farmers and so forth. So the list goes on, and also definitely lack of economic diversification is one of these. But just wanted to point that out. And the other thing that we failed to sort of mention alongside is that amidst all of this crisis thinking and our conversation here about agriculture, we forgot to mention two of the most highly vulnerable groups of people who have been highly impacted in the COVID-19, and these are women and youth. Women specifically, because many of them are tied to a direct, either on the consumption end, they're the ones that are going out and buying these things, the food items, but also they've been the small sales, sort of, or like street sales kind of processing and act as street vendors. On top of that, in the lockdown, there are a lot of social issues that have emerged that highlights the issues in our environment in the MENA region, anywhere from domestic violence to so forth. And these are really important things to think about as we're thinking about our systems and our cycle and our society and how we're responding about these things. And youth, as their lack of access to employment and income situation here, or having to support or having to contribute to family income and the way we are thinking. So I'm saying, what I'm saying here is that we need to think about the long-term implication, and what this crisis has highlighted systematic challenges on the economic and the social space as well. And what we need to really do in terms of addressing food and nutrition from the MENA perspective, and what can the government, or not just what the government can do, but what can everyone on the street level do, is adopt more of a systems thinking, that we are not dealing with isolated incidents or isolated products or isolated subsectors, that everything now is connected. And if we try to think of things in terms of systems, then when I'm looking at agriculture, then I'm no longer focusing on just using water, but I'm thinking also of sustainability. Or I'm looking at imports, then I'm also thinking about infrastructure and these kinds of things. One specific thing that we have failed to consider even as we considered investments in Africa, for example. And I'm going to give an example of how the Chinese are investing in Africa versus how as countries from the Middle East started investing in Africa. So when I was in West Africa, for example, the hotel we stayed in was a Chinese hotel, Solh, and it turns out that the company that's doing most of the oil exploration, I'm not going to go into the details of the environmental hazards and the lack of attention to environmental standards and so forth by the leading Chinese companies, but they've build an infrastructure around the particular investment that they're doing. And one thing that we think about as we think about investing in agriculture and we think about these systems, we have to think about everything. If we think about it in terms of a system, then I'm no longer just investing in Africa to supply the Middle East. No, I have to also think about investing in the infrastructure, in the logistics, the social impacts in that particular country that I'm investing in. And so having these connections. If I'm having a systems thinking, I can no longer just think about health by itself or food prices by itself. So for example, I can't just subsidize bread and make it available at such cheap prices that then I start having an obesity issue or an overconsumption in a high carb diet in the Middle East, and then have a whole conglomerate of health issues in non-communicable diseases that actually makes these particular population groups also highly vulnerable to COVID-19. As we all know, that obesity is one of the contributors to contracting more of the deadly types of COVID-19. So if I'm thinking about health and food choice, these are two things that are highly connected, which means it's not just about cheap food, but about how do I educate the consumer? When I'm putting subsidies out there, how am I providing a basket of food? How am I putting this health? How am I bringing health education on the consumption level in terms of the MENA region? And that's something that's lacking, especially when we look at the poorer segments, which is really most of our communities or most of the society in the Middle East. We've got a very large portion that living under $1 a day and under $2 a day. So we have to consider about how we are improving their access, but also improving their health education, improving these items. The other thing that we should think about is alternatives to food products. So if I can't have meat, what can I have that will also, if I can't have bread? So trying to bring innovation and again, agri-tech space is a really big contributor to this. So how do I invest in the agri-tech space and bring food alternatives to the table that is affordable and healthy at the same time? And then the last item is if I am going to continue my dependency on food imports, how do I bring forward, or I open up the space so that I'm developing the private sector to become not just a food importer, but also a food investor. To give you an example, there are several of the Venus, for example, in Egypt, or several of the Moroccan firms that have highly focused on just importing food. So they're sort of the comparable, the counterparts of a Cargill or an ADM in a way, not really, but they have not thought of structured investments that we had, like, similar to what we've seen from ADM and Cargill, meaning I'm investing in the farmer overseas, I'm investing in the logistics and the infrastructure, I'm investing in distribution, and I'm investing in connecting these to various markets. So really building a more active private sector that's up to date in terms of the market structures. But again, you know, we have to think of, just to sum this up, in terms of systems thinking, not just in terms of subcategories or product groups and so forth. We definitely need to connect health and food choice together to how we're addressing COVID-19 issues. We need to be thinking long-term and not just be thinking, you know, about the crisis. Yes, we do need to have measures in order to meet the dire need of the poor, especially in the middle class that's constantly getting poorer in the region. And we definitely need to continue, or to actually start aggressively investing in agri-tech and agriculture investments that will provide food alternatives, healthy nutrition, and also private sector development.
Thank you, Dr. Ghada, for your significant comments on the global value change and the system thinking. My last question is to Dr. Mahmoud Solh. As a member of the HLPE and the former Director General of ICARDA, you have decades of experience engaging with policy leaders throughout the MENA region. In your experience, what is the most important step they can take to promote food security post-COVID-19?
You're muted, Dr. Mahmoud.
Okay, this is certainly a very important question, and because, to be honest with you, the political will and political support is key to make change towards better food security, no doubt about it. I can use several examples in the MENA region. I want to compare Morocco and Algeria. Morocco has always put agriculture high on its agenda, while Algeria in the 80s, 90s, they invested in industry. Algeria has much more potential in agriculture. When you look at resources, I'm talking about the 80s, and Morocco. While Morocco, now they do have 1.6 million hectares of irrigated agriculture. They had 300, 400 in the 80s. So if you look at food prices in Morocco versus Algeria, much, much cheaper in Morocco than Algeria. So I think because of the political will in Morocco, you see this different food security. You don't see poverty in Morocco like many other Arab countries, but you don't see hunger in Morocco. This is what I want to emphasize. The other point is what we have seen in Syria. You know, Syria, before the unfortunate developments, before 2011, Syria in 2004, 2005 used to produce 5 million tons of wheat, and they consume about 3.5 million tons. They used to export in good rainy years, they used to export 1 million ton of wheat. And look what happened after the unfortunate developments. Syria barely producing 1.5 million ton. Now it is improving, but certainly not like before. The other good example is Iraq. Iraq was self-sufficient almost in many major food crops, I would say before the war in Iraq. and because of the priority that was on agriculture in Iraq. Even Egypt, in the 90s, at the time of Prime Minister Wali, agriculture used to be very high priority. Now Egypt is gaining momentum back in agriculture. So I think it depends a lot whether the politicians realize the value of agriculture or not. And this is where I think very important with these crises, it is an incentive for the politicians to put agriculture high on the political agenda.
Thank you very much, Dr. Solh. And now the last moderated question goes to Rachel Bahn. Are there any initial patterns seen in the policy responses of governments in MENA to COVID-19? If so, what are they?
Well, thank you, Martin, for the question. The actions we've seen taken so far, at least as reported in media, do tend to be clustered around the availability dimension of food security. So focusing on agricultural production or food supply. Some on access, relatively less on utilization. So there have been measures to ensure the availability of food through securing inputs or reducing import duties to limit price shocks. So that was done, for example, in Morocco on soft wheat until end 2020. Certain countries are taking efforts to build stockpiles of critical or strategic food products, like Egypt is doing with wheat. And some countries are pursuing an overseas investment strategy once again. We've seen reports of that in Saudi Arabia. On more kind of market channels, we've seen some efforts to ensure market access for food producers, stimulus paid for local food production, and also actions to ensure the health and safety of agri-food workers so that those production channels and market channels don't break down. There's been more efforts in reporting around agricultural and food price monitoring to keep an eye on spikes so that governments could presumably intervene if needed. And there have also been reports around social safety nets and stimulus payments, not only in agricultural and rural communities, but to those who are vulnerable to food insecurity. Where we're seeing the gaps tend to be more on the utilization side. So there's been some work around access, but less around utilization. And again, that reflects a longer term policy trend where the focus has been on producing, making sure that there's enough stock, but less about what that means for actual nutrition and consumption. We haven't heard too much yet about monitoring and recording of timely data, but again, we know that that's an opportunity, building on what Ghada said, use of digital technologies there, crowdsourcing, be an opportunity for fast, cheaper, more responsive collection and use of data. So that's an opportunity, but I don't know that we've seen too much use of that yet. The other gap, that just longer term strategic thinking. Will there be bigger thinking about food systems post-COVID? What is the optimal path for reinvestment in agricultural production? What is the optimal path for these reformulated global food trade pathways? So I think maybe there's initial thinking, but we have more to learn. Just a plug for anybody who's interested in these issues, they should follow the Twitter @foodpandemic, and that's actually kind of pushing out a lot of the kind of emerging and breaking stories around food policy responses across the MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Now it's time to open up to our attendees. We already received a few questions. The first one comes from Camille Salame. And Camille, may I just unmute you so you can ask the question yourself?
Thank you. In the Q&A section, I've posted a comment, and I've referred to the 17 SDGs that have been adopted by the General Assembly and the signatories as of 2015. And as I have mentioned, the philosophy of everything is connected to everything. Many of the parameters that have been looked at to gauge the nations that have signed on to the 17 SDGs have not been really met very well. The goal number 2, I believe, is zero hunger. If you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Unfortunately, if we focus on the MENA, COVID-19 has truly uncovered many of the defects. The old world order, right post after World War II, which is the Bretton Woods Agreement, is no longer serving the world, and the new world order must be accepted by all members of the UN. Coming back to the MENA region, as all of the panelists have stated, collective work is important. And as I've mentioned in my statement in the Q&A, we are all living in one big village. Globalization was a luxury that no longer is. The MENA region in particular has to collaboratively look inward and focus on nation building. As Dr. Mahmoud said, are they going to put differences aside and focus on nation building? Food is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Water resources are a serious matter in the MENA region. Will the political will change? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to briefly add, Dr. Salama is a former consultant general surgeon from Saudi Arabia, and he's one of Saudi's key health experts. So who would like to answer his question? Perhaps Dr. Turki or Dr. Mahmoud?
I'll take Dr. Salama. First of all, my congratulations and my appreciation, Jazakum Allah alf khair, for all you doctors and all your friends on the SDGs and the Saudis' Vision 2030 and the G20s. The pandemic have put all the 17 SDGs as a second online, because no matter what, government have a limited resources, and they put all their resources on the medicals and the support of the well-being of their societies. However, Saudi Arabia, because it is the president of the G20s, they have allocated and they have pressed for allocation, if it come out of my memory, more than $500 million to help all the poor countries and the highly affected. So cooperation is a must. And this is one of the major issues that is the G20, which is will be held in November in Riyadh. They will cover this SDGs, and it is their priority. But as the crisis happened, it became to be the second priority, not the full priority. I give the floor to Dr. Mahmoud if you want to have other to answer.
Thank you, Dr. Rasheed. You covered a good part of what I wanted to say. One thing which you rightly indicated, Dr. Salama, is the fact that regional cooperation is so critical for regional food security. The Arab world, I have to say, have countries with high potential in agriculture, countries with medium potential, countries with limited potential. But in reality, the potential of production in the Arab world has never been exploited well. I can give you example. Sudan is a good example. Iraq is a good example. Syria is a good example. Morocco is a good example. Algeria is, all of these countries are high potential area in agriculture. We have another set of countries that are medium in potential. We do have the resources. We do have the energy, both renewable and non-renewable energy and their sources. Therefore, if in reality we put our differences aside, political or otherwise, and work in the way the European Union is working, in the best interest of economic security and nutritional security, I'll tell you the Arab world does not have to import what it imports. We have data in ICARDA that shows what Iraq can do, what Sudan can do, what Syria can do, what Morocco can do, and including Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries as well. The whole area of hydroponics in the GCC countries is flourishing now. And certainly there is lots of potential there. So I personally feel, I'm talking about firsthand experience, that the potential in the Arab world is great, provided we do regional cooperation, avoid the political differences, and work in the best interest of the people of the Arab world.
I just wanted to add something quickly, and I'll be very brief. I mean, nation building is such an overused term, so I would caution about thinking the way we're thinking about nation building. I think we should be thinking about people building for a change in the Middle East. How are we investing in the citizens, or how are we investing in the region? And this is why I mentioned education as one of the #1 things. If we are to educate the farmer, that's one of the key elements in improving the sector. We can talk about regional development and regional collaboration forever. Gosh, it's been discussed before I was even born, and it's a topic that gets discussed in Africa. Regional cooperation between sub-Saharan countries, or sub-Saharan, it's a constant that it's kind of, it would be great, but I think as a start, if we just focus on people building. And building resilience, and the building blocks for these things, and develop a system thinking instead of being in our own little cubes. We've been, the MENA region has been stuck in posturing and various types of unrest, political, social, and regional unrest on multiple levels. And therefore, each country has been forced to think in silos. To try to kind of unpack or sort of change that overnight is going to be a tough thing. Especially that's been cemented over the last 50 years. I think a lot of young people in the region are tired of that sort of mantra. We talk about it as a dream, or as as something we would all strive for. But I really think we should be investing and thinking about people building as #1.
Thank you very much. I would now like to ask Mohammed Al-Zohbi, I think, from, I don't know. The floor is yours. Mohammed.
Okay, thank you for giving me the chance. I'm from Lebanon.
Can you quickly introduce yourself also too?
Okay, I'm an agricultural engineer working with an international NGO. From Lebanon. So my question is for Mr. Turki. Mr. Turki, you were talking about the implementation of a sustainable food strategy in Saudi Arabia. And it's a really good work, but the strategy should be socially accepted, and locals in the region should be ready for it and aware about the importance of the agriculture and agri-food sectors in the sustainable development. Because, at the end, you need the human resource as a part of this strategy. So my question is, are you doing any awareness sessions with the locals in order to orient them about the importance of the agriculture and the agri-food sectors in the sustainable development? I mean, through universities, school, TV shows. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, for your questions. The summary of my book, which is the Public Governance and Strategic Management Capability, is there is no strategies, not whatsoever, can succeed without the full participations of all the stakeholders. So if any strategies, whether it is a nation building or human building, without the participations of all the stakeholders, it will not go anywhere. We have seen many strategies, whether it is a national strategies or a local strategies, it didn't succeed. And the success of any strategy is not something new. If you look at Joseph the Dreamer, Surah Yusuf alayhi salam, it's all about strategies. You have to look at the three triple bottom line, which is the financial, the profits, the prosperity, the people, the planet. If you don't get involved all these three elements at the same time, and you get the stakeholders' involvement, you will not succeed. So unless we get involved all the stakeholders, we will never succeed. The top-down approach, it will never succeed. Or using the expertise from outside, as we could see what happened to Iran, the White Revolution, or whether we look at the Russian, when they brought all the expertise from outside, the result was a failure. But if you look at the strategies of Egypt, when they were the highest on the death of the children, which is the mortality rate, because they took all the sources locally, they have succeeded and they have lowered the death rate. If you look at Saudi Arabia on their food securities, they have achieved it. If you look at the German of the unifications of Germany, they have succeeded. If you look at the Cuba, which is they got their medical, they have put all their resources and they've succeeded. So if you look at Iran, Russia, the result was disastrous. But if you look at when you get involved of all the stakeholders, always the result will prevail. So my answer to you, any strategy must get involved all the other stakeholders. And I hope we are doing it. We should do it more, and we should do it more if we want any strategy to succeed. I hope I answered your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turki. We have another question coming from Uganda by Michael Segawa, and I think it actually addresses everyone. He asks, the MENA region has the highest levels of subsidies in the world, especially for food and energy. There is a widespread argument that food subsidies are unsustainable. For example, consumer subsidies for staple foods, cereals, oils, sugar, in many countries of the promoting unbalanced diets, increasing the risk of malnutrition and health among the population. My question is, should subsidies be eliminated, halved, or maintained? Perhaps Rachel Bahn, you can answer this question first.
Sure, thanks for the question. It's tough to give a blanket answer because those policies do differ considerably from country to country. I think maybe one place where you see an example of something that could be done to make a subsidy more reinforcing of food and nutrition security is the example of what Egypt done us over the past couple of years has been to shift away from just a subsidy providing calories to something that offers more space to provide access to nutritious food at affordable prices. So bringing into the food basket, not just sugar, wheat, and cooking oil, but also fresh fruits and vegetables. I think that kind of policy makes a lot of sense and is reinforcing food and nutrition security, especially in a context like right now where you're going to see people moving into poverty. Proposals to cut subsidies without a more nuanced discussion might just be fodder for protest.
Thank you. Anyone else? Dr. Solh, what do you think? Subsidies?
I agree. Subsidies, first of all, I want to mention to him that the difference between MENA region and other parts of the world is that subsidies are provided to farmers in the US and Europe much more than what we have in this part of the world. Our subsidies are for the consumer. Personally, I'm against subsidies as a principle, okay? But certainly with the low-income people and some of the major food crops, provided, as Rachel rightly said, provided we really ensure that subsidies are balanced enough to ensure good nutrition. A good example is India. India is subsidizing now food legumes. They used to subsidize rice and the wheat. Now they are subsidizing chickpea, lentil, and peas and other legumes because of their high protein. So I personally feel subsidies should be phased out gradually, but other services should be provided instead, you know, even to the farmers to lower their cost of production. I think part of the problem that we have in the Middle East and North Africa, our cost of production is very high, and therefore the consumer, when the retail prices becomes really high. So if you can provide services and support to farmers to reduce cost of production, then this whole and phase out subsidies for consumer, this would be a better strategy.
Thank you very much. Ghada, what do you think? It's a hot potato, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it is a loaded question, right? That actually was part of the Arab Spring also. So just something to think about. I mentioned systems thinking, right? And one thing to think about is that the subsidy money has to come from somewhere. It doesn't come from thin air. So we're either going to be continuing to raise taxes or continuing to borrow or do a better job in collecting taxes. So as we're thinking about subsidies, we need to think about where is the money coming from to subsidize these particular programs or projects that we're thinking about. Just something to think about here as we're thinking about subsidies. It's not about the yes or no is such an ultimatum kind of answer, but it's to think about how we're spending the money and which sectors. And as you know, when I mentioned earlier, people building, and I mentioned investing in specific actors in the value chain and that kind of stuff. So in line with that, something to think about: the United States spends over $700 billion on the public education system. So that is in the K-12 education system. Compare that to different farmer support that amounted anywhere between $12 to $20 billion. So if we start thinking about the subsidies as to where we're spending the money and where we're investing. So if I'm thinking about building the farmer capacity and capability, not just to meet immediate demand, but also to be able to build the farmer's capacity and the consumer capacity and different market actor capability to meet current and future market dynamics, which means I'm investing in education and again, the technology and all of these things. I have to start with some level of education, at least address illiteracy rates, high illiteracy rates among the farmer community. Uganda or any of the over 80% of the populations in Africa and a lot of the African countries are illiterate. So the number one thing to think about as we're thinking about subsidies, where am I spending this money and what is the best return on investment for spending the subsidy money?
Thank you very much, Ghada. And of course, we have to ask our private sector representative, what's your take on subsidies, Dr. Turki?
Well, if we talk about subsidies, it's not a matter whether subsidies or not. You have to understand the Arab world are very large number of them is under poverty. They are young. It's how to use subsidies. If we look at Malawi, they have used subsidies, and they have converted subsidies from a food beggar into a food exporter. Rather than countries just give them anything, they start to take fertilizer and good quality seed, and they start to be a food exporter. So the subsidy must be targeted. Unfortunately, many of the subsidies we have, it's like giving subsidize the production of oil or the rice. That subsidy doesn't work because you have to be targeted subsidies. In my studies, the one I made on the restructuring the subsidy, it should be targeted, that it should go to the needed. And the first thing you have to realize first is what is the problem. If you deny the problem, then you could never solve the problem. When I was writing about poverty in Saudi Arabia, I've been fighted by almost everybody. Nobody wants to admit that we have poverty. But when Saudi Arabia and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have decided that we do have poverty and we do have to address it, then we have launched a program called the Citizen Account. which is, it's a targeted for the needed people. Be surprised, but almost 60% of the Saudi population are enrolled in that program, because then you give a targeted people who need it, go for it. It's like giving a medication to everybody, and you said, well, I'm giving you a medication. It doesn't work. It got to go to the needed people, and it must be not only a program without evaluation. It has to be evaluated, it has to be monitored, and it has to go to the right amount of the right peoples. It's like the right medicine for the right doses for the right person.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turki. And with your words, I'd like to close this seminar or this webinar for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for contributing your highly important views on this very urgent subject. And thanks to everyone who joined us today online. So we are going to have another session next week on gender and food security. However, the details will be confirmed very soon. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.